a few housekeeping announcements to make right at the beginning. The first is to say welcome, obviously, to the 90th meeting, I believe, of the Mile End Group. It's about the fourth one that I've attended since I've been at Queen Mary, only since September, and this is the first time I've actually been allowed out of the audience to actually chair the event, so I'm very pleased to be doing that. I should tell you that we are sponsored by our friends at Hewlett-Packard once again. And tonight, the event is also being sponsored by the School of Politics and International Relations, where I am from, and also by the School of Economics and Finance. If any of you out there are tweeting, I believe the handle is @MileEndGroup, all one word, so if you want to take a note of that. I've just spoken to Oliver, and after I've done a quick intro, but I'm going to tell you now so you can think about it, we're going to go straight into Q&A. Oliver's not going to give a speech which you then have to react to. So while I introduce him, if you can be thinking of all the questions that you've long wanted to ask him, or any government minister indeed, fire away.
Almost any.
Almost any, yes, that's right. He reserves the right, obviously, to deflect, I should say, some of the questions, of course. Now, Oliver is that rare species in Parliament, a politician with a PhD, although he's not one, I notice, who uses the title doctor all of the time. Oliver's PhD was in philosophy, which he gained from the University of Cambridge in 1982. With a thesis on emotion and emotions. Am I right in saying that? Right.
Well informed. You're the only person in the world that's ever...
Well, it's available, published by Routledge, 1987, so you can always get to the library if you want to. No doubt...
Please do, it hasn't sold at all.
Oh, right. Like most academic books, I think, that's right. No doubt he's experienced plenty of those emotions and emotion, and since becoming a Conservative MP in 1997, he very quickly made it onto the front bench. He was Shadow Chief Secretary, Shadow Home Secretary, I believe, and Shadow Chancellor. I won't dwell on that period. It's very well covered in an excellent book on the Conservative Party, From Thatcher to Cameron, which probably hasn't sold that many either. And I'll fast forward to 2005, when David Cameron became leader of the Conservative Party. Oliver Letwin was one of those who, I think, very early on was a supporter of David Cameron. And since 2005, he has played a very important role in Conservative policy making, first of all, obviously, in opposition, where he was described by one of his colleagues, unnamed unfortunately, but he may reveal that, as the Gandalf of the process. Quite who was the Frodo and who was the Gollum of the process isn't revealed, but perhaps Oliver might tell us something about that. He also, though, played a very, very crucial part in the formation of our current coalition, because it was Oliver Letwin who, I think more than any other Conservative politician, first realised the extent of overlap and therefore the potential for agreement between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats in the run-up, and that's very important to say that, in the run-up to the 2010 election. And he also realised, I think perhaps more than many of his colleagues, that the likely outcome of that election would be a hung parliament, and therefore began preparing for that eventuality. So when David Cameron famously made his big, open and comprehensive offer to Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats, that offer was actually backed up by some solid homework done behind the scenes by Oliver and his team, which allowed a coalition agreement to be put together in just 5 days. And any of you who know anything about European politics will know that that was an incredibly short space of time, prompted in some ways by concerns about the markets. But certainly it's normally around 3 to 4 weeks in most continental European countries. In this country, we did it in just 5 days. And that is a tribute, I think, to the work that Oliver and his team had put in before the election, and then also put in during those coalition negotiations. So clearly that work paid off in terms of getting the coalition together. But since then, Oliver has played a vital role in government policy more generally. As Simon said, he is Minister of the State Cabinet Office, where he helps coordinate government policy. So really, he is incredibly well equipped, I think, to talk to us both about the Conservative Party, if that's what you'd like to talk about policy making in opposition, and indeed policy making in coalition. So I will hand it over to you. The first question. Yes, over there. Just wait for the microphone and then we can all hear you.
Hello, Dinah Glover, Chairman of Bethnal Green and Bow Conservatives. Thank you for coming to talk this evening. I'm interested in the coalition, how it affects both parties, the difference in the way that it was originally set up within both parties. The Liberal Democrats famously had a conference and were able to vote on the coalition agreement, whereas the Conservative Party was not. And now we're 2 years into the coalition government. I wonder whether you feel that the way that the parties went about consulting their members and their MPs, whether that impacts on the dynamics of the coalition and the commitment perhaps of the different parts that make up each party. And I'm asking this question knowing that the Liberal Democrats obviously have a different constitution to the Conservative Party, but nonetheless I would be interested in your comments.
Yes, I mean, the first thing to say is that just as a matter of fact, the Liberal Democrats' leadership consulted their backbench colleagues, well, indeed their parliamentary colleagues as a whole, and of course I don't know any of the details of what happened there, but I think they certainly, Danny Alexander and Nick Clegg certainly thought that they needed to carry their parliamentary colleagues. I don't think it went wider than that. They didn't have time to go out to their membership. But it was the parliamentary colleagues I mean, you may be right. They had
to rubber stamp an agreement.
Some kind of subsequent discussion with their members, but I don't think there was time for them to get approval before they had in fact agreed with us on what was happening. But you really need a Liberal here to talk about that. So far as the Conservative Party is concerned, I think William Hague rather brilliantly described this when we were talking to one another about the fact that they had to look to their parliamentary party in detail. And when asked why we didn't, though I'll come to a caveat about that in a moment, he explained that, I think accurately, that the Conservative Party's constitution is autocracy moderated by regicide. I mean, that is exactly how the Conservative Party operates. The leader at any given time is effectively empowered, subject to being thrown out by the methods that the party's constitution allows. Nevertheless, I think this difference is slightly less exaggerated than might appear, in the sense that actually we were feeling our way to some degree, and there were two meetings of the parliamentary party, the Conservative Parliamentary Party, which were certainly of some importance. We didn't put a series of propositions to them, and there wasn't voting on them, but there would certainly have been scope for the parliamentary party to make its feelings known if it had felt something very marked about the direction in which we were proceeding, and we would certainly have had to pay an enormous amount of attention to that. So, and what's more, I'm not sure, to judge by the accounts of it, though I see there's only a remote control, or remote lack of control, I'm not sure that the Liberal Democrat leadership was quite as much in hock to its parliamentary party as might have appeared. I think there was quite a lot of work done to make sure that it came along. So there are differences, but I don't think they're quite as stark as they might appear. The last thing I'd say is that I don't think that either party was actually being asked to do much that did much violence to its manifesto. And this comes back to something you said in your introduction. It's by no means always the case, but it was the case on this occasion that if you read both our manifesto and their manifesto, or indeed our rather voluminous policy papers that my team and I and colleagues have been producing over some years, and then read the parallel set produced by Liberal Democrats, there was so much common ground and so few, quite important, but nevertheless so few areas of marked contrast that actually neither party was being asked to do much injustice to its own programme. There were, of course, some notable exceptions to that. We would not have held a referendum on AV if we hadn't been in an alliance, to give an example, well-known examples. But by and large, it's notable that both parties have gone around saying, quite accurately, that the great bulk of the stuff that was in their manifesto is now being enacted by the coalition government. And the reason is that the great bulk of it was actually within an inch of being the same. And I think that was true not just in the letter, but in the spirit of the manifestos. And in fact, rather interestingly, this has continued. There are many frictions and negotiations as we go through. And party conferences, as well as elections, are times when differences are magnified. You look at the last party conference season, and you read carefully the speech given by Nick Clegg, and read carefully the speech given by David Cameron. They sound very different. They have some very different words in them. They were addressed to very different audiences, and they overlap almost 100%. And that's because actually culturally there's a great deal of sympathy and similarity between the attitudes of the leaderships. Now, of course, we have a group of colleagues who are to one side of that, and they have a group of colleagues to the other side of it, and there are great differences. But actually at the centre of each party and at the leadership of each party, there remains, as there was at the beginning, an enormous amount of common ground in many, many different ways. So this was a relatively easy coalition to put together, and therefore required much less permission from the parties than would have been the case if just imagine putting Michael Foot and Margaret Thatcher together in a coalition. That would have required quite a lot of consultation on both sides, because it would have required ditching just about 100% of one or the other manifesto. And I suspect that would have taken more than 4 or 5 weeks to achieve. I don't think that the speed at which we operated was due to some kind of extraordinary genius. I think it was due to the fact it was a relatively easy and limited negotiation.
Okay. Yes, lady up there. Just wait for the mic to reach you. Really great.
Thanks, James. Hi, Ghazala Hack from HP. Interested to know, the Cabinet Office has been at the heart of the current government's efficiency and reform agenda, but traditionally the Cabinet Office hasn't had particularly strong teeth with which to require the long-standing silos that are the big government spending departments to follow its agenda. Nor has it traditionally had, or currently have, particularly strong incentives in that a lot of the revenue benefits that come from efficiencies saved accrue to the Exchequer centrally rather than to the departments. I'm just wondering from your current political perspective, and also generally from a structural perspective, if you feel like the Cabinet Office has the appropriate carrots and sticks to carry out what it needs to do.
Well, the first point I should make, I think, is that although I camp in 9 Downing Street, which is physically and officially connected to and part of the Cabinet Office. My involvement in the Cabinet Office is actually extremely limited. But most of my activity actually goes on in number 10 rather than in the Cabinet Office, or consists of people coming over from number 10 and from the Cabinet Office from other places. I'm one of the people that you're least likely to get a properly informed answer from about what the Cabinet Office as an institution does. I spend a very large amount of my time with some people who also camp in the Cabinet Office, like the Cabinet Secretary and the National Security Advisor, for example, or indeed the European and Global Advisor, the Prime Minister. But that's because we all find ourselves having the same meetings with the Prime Minister and with one another about the shape of government. And so I really don't understand terribly much about the details of the department of which I am nominally a member, whereas I understand much more than I ever wanted to know about number 10. Having said that, there's one part of the Cabinet Office which I particularly interact with, which is, apart from my brilliant private office, which is provided by the Cabinet Office, but other than that, which is the Economic and Domestic Secretariat of the Cabinet. Which certainly has all the capacity it needs to do the job it does very well, which is to organise the process of government. The gentleman sitting next to you wrote a book called The Hidden Wiring. Is that? Yes. Well, they are the hidden wiring, if ever there was any. And they... the management of meetings, the construction of minutes, the smoothing of difference is their stock in trade, as indeed mine. And so I work extremely closely with them. But I think you're referring to the rest of the Cabinet Office, which isn't the Cabinet Secretariat, isn't the National Security Secretariat, and so on, but is the sort of engine room. And that's entirely the domain of my counterpart, Francis Maud, and his colleagues. He is, of course, in charge of the Efficiency and Reform Group that you referred to. And I think, first of all, you really need to talk to Francis about that rather than to me, because he does it day by day and I just observe it from time to time. But I think he works so closely with the Treasury in that work that actually the levers of power, which are largely located in the Treasury financially, are available to him, so to speak. I get the strong sense that he doesn't operate as if he were on his own. He operates with the Treasury, and departments are very keen to play ball with the Treasury because they have to. He's also managed to establish a quite remarkable grip on certain kinds of things which simply can't be done without somebody asking him, and hence asking his officials. The budget for consultancy has shot downwards. The budget for advertising has shot downwards. The reason is, I think, that you can't, as I understand it, hire a consultant. Not that I've ever been inclined to do so, but you can't hire a consultant, you can't advertise, still less would I be inclined to do that, without asking Francis's permission, and the answer is usually no. Rules have been instituted that carry the backing of the Treasury and which have enabled him to exercise a very considerable influence over aspects of government business. But in the end, my sense in the last 2 and a bit years, as in the 80s when I was an apparatchik in number 10 first, is that it's always the same. In the end, governments are run by prime ministers, or in this case by a prime minister and deputy prime minister in coalition, and that's where the power lies. It's where the power of appointment and removal lies, which is in the end the power that matters. If the minister, as Francis does, in the Cabinet Office, dealing with efficiency and reform, has not only the cooperation of the Treasury, but the backing of the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister in his work, then it will be effective. And if he didn't, it wouldn't. And I don't really believe in these institutional structures. It seems to me it's the power relationships that matter, and therefore it's the backing from the centre that counts. The last thing I'd say is I think there is a sort of remarkable tendency, both inside and outside Whitehall, to think as if departments of state had agendas, interests, capacities. And if they do, it's highly regrettable, because it's not in the interests of the people of this country that they should be battled over by great institutions within government. And I think to a very large extent they don't. Occasionally there are such things, but actually the government as a whole has and forms an agenda. Certainly bits of government disagree about all sorts of things, and they represent different sorts of interests, and there's a continuing discussion, of course. But in the end, the decision that gets made is a decision which the government as a whole is accountable to the electorate, to Parliament for, and it's going to fall or survive or prosper accordingly as it's a good decision or a bad decision, not accordingly as it's the decision that one department or another wanted to have foisted on somebody. And whenever I hear people talking as if there was an interest of the Department of X, I reach for my metaphorical gun, because there is no such thing as the interest of Department X. Their interests are synonymous. They are the interests of the people of the United Kingdom as conceived by this government. And that's true under all administrations. And actually, by and large, in my experience, it's how things work. By and large, actually, the policies that we're following are those that are charted in the programme for government. That was put together by the leaderships of the party. Danny and I drafted it. It was approved by the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister and the Coalition Committee. It's carried out by Cabinet. It's not devised by a department. It's not there in the interest of the department. It's there in the interests of vision which the coalition had at the beginning. And if we hadn't had a coalition, we would have had a manifesto. I think the coalition agreement is a more powerful document, interestingly and bizarrely, than a manifesto would have been, because it's contractual in nature. And there's a kind of obligation to carry it out, and therefore more difficult under the coalition for a department to start disappearing off into some direction of its own. Because it has to come back and ask, is this consistent with the coalition agreement? If not, it won't get approval for it, because that's been negotiated and it's a contractual document. But even a manifesto is, if properly conceived, a very powerful central force in government, and it's not departmental. It's explicitly not departmental. So I really reject the whole sort of frame of reference, is what I'm trying to say, that suggests that government consists of these great warring departments, the MOD having an interest, the DFE having an interest, and where that emerges, it needs to be squashed, and we need to get back to thinking of this as it is, which is a government that's trying to do something that it's got in a programme.
Okay, I did say yes to this gentleman down here first, and then I'll come to you.
Charles Rice, formerly of the Evening Standard. Getting back to coalition a bit more widely, beyond the departmental, and never mind the dear old Liberal Democrats, isn't the coalition that's really in trouble the Conservatives on Europe? And when you said in answer to the previous question that the centre and the leadership was where the real power lies, haven't the events of the last few days shown that, as far as Europe is concerned, that is rather far and dangerously far from the truth?
Well, in a word, no. Hello, incidentally. Amazing audience. It's astonishing. I wonder who's going to pop up next. First of all, the events of the last few days actually prove my point. We set out to achieve something in a set of discussions in the EU. We are continuing to set out to achieve something in a set of discussions in the EU. Of course, we've paid very close attention to the fact that there was a vote. but we are continuing to seek to achieve what is achievable and to do what is feasible. And that's very important. So I don't think that the events of the last few days show anything of the kind that you're suggesting. Of course, all parties are coalitions. And of course, it matters a lot what people within both the voluntary parties and the parliamentary parties think, and where the centre of gravity is. And of course, any serious leadership always pays considerable attention to the centre of gravity as it moves. But the fact is that the Prime Minister is the leader of the Conservative Party, and the Conservative members of the Cabinet are Conservatives in the Cabinet, and we make decisions, and it remains the case that it's autocracy tempered by regicide.
And losing the vote in the Commons.
It's perfectly true that a vote was lost in the Commons, so?
Well, if Cameron brings back an answer from the EU that the Commons dislikes again and it's voted down again, would you kindly say where do you think that leads the government?
I think
Would they override the Commons again?
I think you may find that your hypothetical is not fulfilled.
Possibly, but it might be.
Let's wait and see.
Okay, at the back there. Yeah.
Richard Evans, a city headhunter and strong supporter of the Mining Group. Mr. Letwin, in the context of what you said previously about joined-up government and your responsibility, could you try and explain to us what has been described as a shambles, the coalition's energy policy, transport policy, and in fact on Europe? Not my comments, but others. Be grateful if you could actually give a very detailed answer. I think we'd be very interested.
Well, I certainly can't give you a detailed answer on all three of those in one go. Should I take energy? The coalition has an extraordinarily carefully articulated energy policy, and is in the course of having a very prolonged and serious discussion about some of the details of it, which there are differing views about. And we will arrive at a resolution of those in the course of the next few weeks. And then the result of that will become evident, because we're going to bring a bill to Parliament, the energy bill, and a series of accompanying papers. So it will be completely clear where we've decided on the detail. But the detail is the detail, and the overarching pattern is already set and has been for a very long time now, and has been pursued with remorseless consistency. So now I'm in danger of now launching into half an hour's exposition, because I've spent a large part of the last 25 years on this. But let me, it isn't the privacy or otherwise. The problem is I don't want to bore you. But let me sketch some of the elements that are central to it. So first of all, we made a settled decision. Actually, I think both parties, particularly the Conservative Party, 7 years ago, that we wanted to bring an entirely new emphasis to energy efficiency and energy saving. And we therefore developed the idea of the Green Deal, which is a scheme which I'm happy to go into the details of if somebody wants to, but which basically enables households to insulate themselves and make themselves more energy efficient, and which was interestingly then adopted by one Ed Miliband when he was at DEC, and is therefore, I think, now a tripartisan policy, but it was originally ours and then Liberal and then all three. We associated with that, again, 6-7 years ago, a very clear strategy of moving to the rollout of smart meters, the length and breadth of this country, and the rollout of a smart grid. And again, I think both of those, I think I'm right in saying, remain, certainly were tripartisan policies. We tried to establish a basis of energy saving which was not partisan and long-lasting, so that it could roll out and maintain itself over many years. And the consequences of that are enormously significant because the whole structure of the electricity industry, electricity supply industry back to the 50s had been a Stalinist one where you assume a given set of load curves, demand across the day as Coronation Street appears or people go off to use their kettles or whatever, and then you built machines and you delivered electricity. And we're moving to a kind of electricity internet which is much more interactive and where people 10 years, entirely unrecognizable 10 years from now, you'll be using your iPhone or whatever to program the machines in your house to respond to the time of day and the pricing signals. You'll be driving over the next 10, 20, 30 years electric cars, which are a battery for the nation. They both absorb electricity and give it out at different times of day. That interacts with the smart grid and the computers in those electric cars. And that creates an entirely new scene in which intermittent energy, particularly therefore renewable energy, has a completely different value than it would have without that degree of consumer response, because the car can be charged up when the wind is at the right level or the sun is shining, whatever it may be, that's producing renewable energy and gives a different kind of value to renewable energy, turning it into a kind of capacity. We also decided to back a series of moves, therefore, to bring forward renewable energy with continuity of the renewable obligation certificate regime, which had been invented in the 90s, but added to it a preference for feed-in tariffs, which again became a tripartisan policy and which we've fully introduced, renewable heat incentives, which we fully introduced, a green investment bank to promote the development of those things, and then the architecture of the energy bill to come with contracts for difference and a capacity market. And allied to all of that, we decided that we needed a balanced portfolio of generation, and therefore concluded that we would not go for gas or for renewables or for nuclear alone, but rather have a conscious mix, which is why we've continued to negotiate for new nuclear plants and are at an advanced stage of negotiation. Hinkley C have just managed to facilitate the sale of the Wolfer site to Hitachi, and are now also working on combined cycle gas turbine development by adding in carbon capture and storage, which enables the gas system to be zero carbon, so that a combination of renewables and nuclear and gas with CCS can deliver a very, very low carbon electricity supply industry, which in turn makes the electrification of the car fleet, which incidentally removes a vast pile of carbon from the car fleet, a proposition which makes sense in the light of the energy saving devices and the smart grid and the smart meters and the whole of the capacity and contract for difference markets. Now, this is a very highly articulated, very carefully conceived, very long developed system. Of course, it leaves you with certain kinds of important choice to make. Just exactly how much money are you willing to devote to renewables over which period through the Renewable Obligation Certificate or the CFD regimes, encapsulated in something called the Levy Control Framework, which is the Treasury's method of controlling the total amount added to customer bills, and we're debating the exact level of that. You have to ask yourself exactly at what rate you'll decarbonize the electricity supply industry and what constraints you impose on the contract for difference and capacity mechanisms to achieve that. And that's a very important set of judgments which are linked to the fourth and fifth carbon budgets. And we're debating exactly how that will work. So there are details that are being hotly debated. But the policy as a whole, the architecture of the policy as a whole, is extraordinarily consistent and coherent and being carried through remorselessly. All of the aspects of what I've described, which were twinkles in the eye 2 years ago, are now either in place, as in the Green Investment Bank, or well advanced, as in the Green Deal and the smart meters and smart grid and so on. I think that's quite an interesting example of a general point, which is that you may like or dislike, approve of or not approve of any number of the reforms and changes that this coalition government is engaging in across vast terrains of education, both higher and school and indeed training, and FE, health, policing, welfare, energy, and so on and so forth. The remarkable truth, and it is a truth, regardless of the value you place on it, whether you think it's good or bad, is that this is a government which set out a plan, which you can read, it's published in the Programme for Government, and is doing it. Whatever you can describe it as, you certainly cannot describe it as incoherent or ineffective. It is a government which is engaged in more profound reform, not just fiscal deficit reform and public service reform, but across a wide range of other areas, including, for example, energy, on a scale which has never previously happened in our country. Whether that's a success or a failure is for electorates to judge. Whether it's ideologically congenial to you or not is for you to judge. But the fact is it's happening. And that is a very major achievement. And it comes about because we set it out very clearly and because we have done a great deal of thinking about it in opposition, perhaps more than has ever been done before. In the 80s, the Thatcher regime benefited hugely from the work that had been done in the late 70s by Keith Joseph and others, but that was was somewhat slightly involved in it as a very young man. And it was done at a high conceptual level and then translated gradually over a long period into more and more explicit policy. So, for example, the great privatizations of the Thatcher eras, which I was much involved in later, were not foreshadowed in the opposition years. It was a very tentative program in '79. In our case, it's very different. We came in with a very fully fledged program, and we've been implementing it at an extraordinary speed and against very extraordinary circumstances. And I remain amazed that we've had, so to speak, the permission to do this. I mean, obviously many people disagree with many parts of it, and many people disapprove of many parts of it, inevitably. But we have the permission to carry it through. You might ask, how have we managed to remove 500,000 posts from the public services, halve the value of public sector pensions without massive strikes? How have we managed to reform policing, schools, health, prisons, and without huge dislocation? I think the answer is people recognize that there was a national crisis and are willing at least to acquiesce in efforts to cure these problems, which is again remarkable. And perhaps also the fact of coalition has made that easier. Perhaps the fact that there is, with the exception of a recent vote you point to, one or two other cases, by and large, a pretty consistent, pretty working majority in the House of Commons, and the fact that it's also supported by two political parties rather than opposed by two political parties, maybe that's part of the answer. But I suspect the historians looking back on this period, whether it's judged a success or a failure, in terms of the results, I obviously believe it will be successful. I hope it will be successful. I'm not trying to prejudge that, but whichever it's judged, I think the historians will certainly want to look at the question, why has it been able to do so much?
I mean, can I just interject there? I mean, the government's energy policy, going on your description, sounds fantastic. It must be a huge source of frustration then that the media and the public only pick up on the fact that the Minister of State hates wind farms and the minister approves of them. I mean, what do you do about that? Is that a communication problem simply?
Yeah, I don't get terribly sort of fussed and bothered about these things. We have some very distinguished journalists in the room. Journalists need stories, and journalists will write stories, and they're much more interesting. I mean, what I've just said is as boring as sin. Nobody's going to write about it. Well, how right you are. I do apologise. It's much more boring than sin. Good news. Well, when I say good news, I mean, the news that the government is carrying forward a programme with remorseless consistency is not a headline. It's not even an op-ed. It disappears without trace. I have to be grown up about this. You just have to recognise that that's the fact.
Right. Okay. All right. Question down here.
Kevin Tebbit, former Permanent Secretary.
really is a remarkable audience.
That's the Mile End group for you?
I'm not going to ask you about stovepipes or indeed about Europe, although having just been in Germany at the weekend, I must say I hope what is feasible is also going to be realistically accepted here, because the Germans are getting pretty fed up with us, I'm afraid. But my question's different. Lord Heseltine has just given himself a massive, wide-ranging report covering almost all aspects of industrial policy, training skills, regional policy, issues which he's been passionate about over the years, and he's brought them together in what is, I think, a quite remarkable document. I wonder, it was a very personal document, I wonder what your personal view is of what is good there and interesting, and what you think perhaps is, if I may say so, perhaps no longer relevant to the next couple of decades.
Well, I mean, needless to say, I've had various conversations with Michael as he's developed this, and I think it is an enormously helpful document. It's not just a document either. It's as you've seen, and as others will see if they read it. It's an idea. It's more than just a set of words. There's a lot more that comes out as you start thinking through its implications. I think one of the things which is really important about it is that he's understood in a way which hadn't, I think, previously really been understood by any other outside or semi-outside thinker, which is the importance of, or the potential importance of the local enterprise partnerships, the LEPs. And that's really the centerpiece for him. And I think he's right that we are at least edging, this is experimental, inevitably, but we are edging our way towards a new kind of relationship between business and local government, and hence between business and local government and central government in the localities, in the great cities above all. And this is connected with city deals and many other things that are going on, and also connected, of course, with localism. And the whole of the Localism Act. But it's more than that. I think that there has been a remarkable contrast between the way that affairs have been conducted in England, anyway. I know more about England than I know about other parts of the UK, but certainly in England, there's been a remarkable contrast between that and the way in which it's perfectly natural to conduct affairs in France or in Germany, for example. Local government has become, many, many years, to a considerable extent, somehow disengaged from local business. And I think that the underlying idea of the regional development agencies was probably to try to cure that in some sort of way. I think they were heroically unsuccessful, not all and to the same extent, but broadly heroically unsuccessful. Now, I don't know whether the LEPs will succeed where regional development agencies failed, but it is a real effort to bring business into the heart of local decision making, so that questions like, where do we put things and what do we have here, aren't any longer seen as business fighting local government, but as the two working together. And what Michael is really saying is that provides you with a huge opportunity for central government to devolve more decision-making power to that combination of business and local government, and hence to achieve coherent results in real places. And I think what comes through very much from his report is something which I more and more feel myself, that you can have endless futile conversations in Whitehall about how to join up different things, and you can have numerous committees, I'm sure you've chaired some of them in your time, trying to do this, but it's all at such a remove from anything out there that it's largely meaningless. Whereas if you're sitting in even a great, huge place like, I don't know, Manchester, let alone Dorchester in my own constituency, and you conceive the needs of the place and you know, and everyone else in the room knows the place. And they know one another, they know the businesses that are involved, they know what the problems are, they know where there are good schools and they know where there are not so good schools, they know what FE colleges can do things, they understand where the roads are causing problems. This becomes real. And if government can find ways, as we have been over the last 2 years, edging our way towards finding, of giving real power to combinations of that kind in the localities, I think you do get a joining up, which is vastly better than you could possibly get in the abstraction in Whitehall. And just to give you one example, any serious analysis of Britain's problems with growth over the long term always comes back to the question of skills. Not, of course, to the question of whether our greatest universities can train people to the highest levels or provide research of a world class. We all know that this is one of the great jewels of Britain. But actually, can we provide a high level of the right training and the right skills for the great mass of those of our citizens who are going to be employed? And there's no doubt at all that compared to someone like Germany, we lag in that. Any analysis shows that. And then you ask, well, what does this mean? Well, one of the things, at least, it means is to make sure that you're training people in the things that there is demand for locally. So the training doesn't go by the board. I'm just trained and then unable to use it. And so that local employers can find people trained in what it is they need. Now, that is a local issue. There's no point in training people in discipline X in Manchester if the employers who are going to employ them are all in Liverpool. I'm not saying that nobody might migrate, but there won't be enough of them. And you'll be left with people in Manchester being trained in something where there isn't demand for. So, if you ask about something like training, you really want to get to a position where somehow the people who are responsible for the training and the people who are paying for the training and the people who are doing the employing of the people who are trained are somehow sitting down together in a place and say, we need people who know about advanced techniques of welding next year in Manchester. What are we going to do about this? And that's a question that would be totally recognisable in Germany and almost unrecognisable in Britain. And what Michael is really saying is we have to transcend that problem. We have to find the means of actually working out how we do what has to be done in a place. And I think that's a very, very powerful theme, so I expect that a great deal will come of it.
Okay, thank you. I've just had one from there, yeah?
Good evening. My name is Rima. I'm from St Paul's Way Trust School. My question is, if the election result is similar next time, would you go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and would your party support you?
This is one of these wonderful hypotheticals that you kindly said I could deflect. Of course, I hope that there will be a Conservative majority administration after the next election. Therefore, we won't have to make such accommodations and so on. And so confident am I of this result that I don't want to speculate about what might happen in any other world. I'm sorry not to answer your question. Much too dangerous.
Good try, though. Yes, one here, right at the front.
Michelle Clement, Mylan Group. Do you think a Prime Minister's department is needed?
That's a question I can answer, and my answer is no. I don't think that inventing new departments has much merit. I remember when all problems in Britain were going to be resolved by the invention of the CPRS. The CPRS no longer exists, and all problems in Britain were not cured by its invention. I remember reading hilarious accounts. I was too tiny to see it from my own eyes. About the creation of the Department of Economic Affairs, which isn't from Yes Minister, it's a real thing. There's positively the funniest account which has ever been written of any public event of George Brown, who was then the Secretary of State there, trying unsuccessfully because the car broke down to get to a meeting, the location of which he couldn't discover, where the CBI and the TUC, I think, were negotiating what they would make of his national plan, which the DEA was putting forward. He needn't have bothered, really. He could have sat at home by the fireplace because neither the Treasury nor Number 10 were going to pay the slightest attention to the product of the DEA, which never managed to establish itself and has now disappeared. You know, the history of Britain is littered, in other words, with the creation of things which haven't worked. I really go back to my answer earlier. Governments operate on the basis of people and the confidence they command, principally with the Prime Minister, or in this case, Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, and with their colleagues. And on the basis of real ability to make particular things happen, to take laws to Parliament, to produce white papers, and creating new institutions doesn't solve things. If you have problems because of the relationships, you will have the problems after you've created the new institution, just as you had them before. My sense is that Number 10 now and in the 80s, and reading the accounts, obviously I don't know this firsthand, of Blair and Mandelson and Campbell and so on. My sense is also through the Labour years that Number 10 was perfectly able to make its will felt without having a great department around it. And in fact, I suspect if you built a great department around it, you would probably end up with less effective control from Number 10, because the department then spent a large amount of time consulting its own naval and concerning itself with its own career structures and so on, whereas at the moment the building revolves entirely around the Prime Minister, and it's there as a very effective transmission mechanism for the will of the Prime Minister. It attracts people of the absolutely highest calibre. I mean, I've now coming back in, and then in the 80s, I've been equally impressed by the calibre of the people that serve in Number 10, and I don't think there's any shortage of ability to transmit the Prime Ministerial will. So, no, I see no advantage at all in creating. Now, probably Peter Hennessy is just about to write a book called The Prime Minister's Department, The Need for One, in which case I shall read it.
Okay, just behind Peter Hennessy, actually. Man with his hand up there.
Thank you. Alan Evans, Queen Mary and Marlene Group, but for completeness, I'm a civil servant in the Scotland office at the moment. I wonder if I could try a different tack on policy making and ask you to comment on how effectively you think the current government uses good science to inform policy making. Criticism some years back was that science didn't inform policy making, which is why one had things like foot and mouth and the flu pandemics not being handled well. But arguably, if you look at more recent developments like ash clouds from Iceland or even ash tree diseases from Denmark, the centrality of science to policy making isn't perhaps all it should be. And I wonder whether you'd agree that possibly one of the shortcomings is that the way in which we do what I'd call domestic horizon scanning in the UK is not perhaps as effective as the way in which we do foreign horizon scanning via the Joint Intelligence Committee, which has been tried and tested over many years.
Well, I think it's a very interesting area, this. You're presumably aware that there is quite a lot of horizon scanning that goes on, the Foresight programme and so on. Sir John Beddington and his colleagues spend a certain amount of time trying to look ahead at the science. I think you're right that we can do more and better. I think the difficulty is to know what to make of what you get out of those exercises. And indeed, to know what to make of things you're told ex post. The science is enormously important, but it does not deliver you answers about what to do about it in many cases. It certainly shows you from time to time things that you certainly wouldn't want to do and it can also alert you to things you ought to worry about. But what it doesn't tell you is what's the practical method of dealing with something, or indeed how to balance conflicting concerns. And so I think there's a sort of there's an art in here which isn't a science, which is less developed than the science, and which I think we, and indeed as far as I can see many other countries, could do with developing more, but which isn't something for the scientists to do. And that's the art of trying to understand how to use the science as a tool for policy making. You can't just say, I've got the answer, here's the scientist, he's told me it. You have to understand how to translate that into policy making. The current position with ash trees is a very interesting example. The science tells us some things. Some things the science can't tell us because there are things that are not well known yet. It doesn't wholly predict what will happen next. Still less does it tell you how you should balance conflicting concerns about, on the one hand, doing too much and unnecessarily destroying trees that you didn't need to destroy, or on the other side, doing too little and not creating enough of a firewall.
We didn't know about the year, did we?
You now come to all sorts of interesting questions like who we is and what we knew. In 2009, as I understand it, there was already some presence of this disease. That's a long time ago, but clearly from 2009 onwards, an awful lot of people didn't know what would happen in Britain. I mean, I remember when avian flu was all the rage. I went along to a meeting in DEFRA. This was under the previous government, and I was invited to do so very courteously. You didn't mention one of my previous posts. I was Shadow Secretary for Environment. Margaret Beckett was the Secretary of State. She very kindly invited us over to be briefed about all of this. And we sat there, and the scientists from DEFRA, who distinguished, explained what they did and did not know. And it became apparent to me that what they knew was impressive, and what they didn't know was even more impressive. If you consulted the BBC or many of the newspapers, you would have believed that it would have been appropriate at that stage to invest billions or take vast steps to counteract this appalling thing. As a matter of fact, it never became anything terribly serious here. Now, how do you ask the right questions and interpret the answers in a way that produces a balanced, proportionate response that properly consults the level of risk and the level of reward? That is a jolly tricky question. You know, if QMC wants to earn its place in future history, I would suggest that it spends the next many years trying to tell us all how to do that, because I don't think anybody anywhere in the world really quite knows. And it's, you know, undoubtedly we'll have to feel our way towards it. It's going to become, it's always been hugely important. It's going to become more and more important. Let me give you one final example, which I think is very, very striking. If you like, this is in the opportunity rather than the threat category. I sit around and talk to distinguished scientists in the field of genetics and molecular biology and so on. And I think it's true to say that we have more around us than anywhere else in the world at the moment. And you talk to them about what genomics is revealing about stratified medicine, about the opportunity to disaggregate what had been thought of as single diseases into particular etiologies that apply to particular groups of people, and about the ability to cure not 20 or 10% of the cases, but 90 or 100% of the cases, with a completely different kind of medicine, with a different relationship between research and development and profit, different degrees of usefulness and application and so on. If you talk about all that, you realize that medicine is about to change as profoundly as the world of communication has changed as a result of the internet. We're on the eve of probably the most exciting set of developments that probably will be, I think, regarded as mainly what has happened in this set of decades. My guess is that when the history books are written, the first little bit of this century will be regarded as the time when the internet revolutionized communication, and the next bit will be regarded as the time when genomics revolutionized medicine. I suspect people will not be able to remember much else compared to those things unless some cataclysm occurs. It's that exciting, it's that profound. What are we to make of this as policymakers? What are the implications? How should we think about the health service? How should we think about the insurance markets? How should we think about aging? How should we think about social care? These are colossal questions. And when you sit down with the scientists who are engaged in this extraordinary voyage of fantastic discovery, and you try to get from them a clear picture of where it will not end, but even be 5, 10, 15 years from now, they don't know. They have absolutely no idea. In fact, they look at you as if you're completely mad for the very good reason they are engaged in making it happen, not in speculating about what might happen. And for the policymaker, that poses an enormous set of questions. How should we assume it's going to develop when we know we don't know? So I don't think that it's a question of devising some easy system, which would just mean that if we had a few more scientists thinking in a few more rooms in some orderly fashion, we would know the answers. I think it's a question of trying to work out better and better ways of dealing with scientific uncertainty and scientific understanding alike, and trying to balance the one against the other, and trying to get a much better sense of proportionality and risk than we currently have in governments around the world. And that, I think, is an enormous challenge.
Okay, Peter Catterall, and actually we'll take Peter Catterall and Peter Hennessy. So we'll take the two Peters asking questions, and then maybe, Oliver, you can finish actually with your joint answer to those two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Catterall, University of Westminster and Hansard Society. I'm tempted to start off by asking about one area of the coalition agreement, which is, of course, civil liberties, which arguably was one of the easier areas to manage. But I noticed that a number of the NGOs who are interested in that area seem to be somewhat disappointed with the production that the government has actually undertaken, and that they feel that the extent to which we've rowed back from some of the more some of the ways in which New Labour moved into damaging civil liberties has not happened in the way that a number of people hoped under the coalition. So I'm tempted to ask about where you think you haven't delivered on the programme. But I also really wanted to ask a bigger question, which is how has...
Bigger?
Sorry. Sorry about that. I want to ask, how do you think the experience of coalition has changed, if at all, the way in which you think about conservatism? Because it does pose problems about how do you manage to be a conservative in this situation, particularly in the light of the way in which you are arguing the world is changing. So I'd like your views on that, please. Thank you.
Okay, and then Peter Hennessy.
Thank you, Oliver, very much for a terrific evening. I want to ask you about an idea of yours and the conversion of it into policy, because for the last 2.5 years I've been trying to grasp the idea of the big society. And 6 months ago I thought I had a cunning plan that would smoke you out, and I put down a question asking the Cabinet Office to list those aspects of the big society programme that each individual minister was responsible for. And I got an answer of genius, which said in so many words, it's not a programme, it's a state of mind. And you were brought into it because they said, and the Cabinet Office ministers are particularly enthusiastic about it. Now, we have to set exam papers occasionally. Can you distill the big society into one sentence that we can use in this exam question? Because I've tried, Oliver, and I can't do it.
So Peter's essentially asking you to...
Can I? I mean, I'm going to answer you in a sense in a moment. But let me just say that an appropriate response actually would be, can you in a single sentence describe Great Britain? And the answer is no. Well, not a good sentence anyway. And yet, I think we all, roughly speaking, know what Great Britain is. At least we know what it isn't. And while we're at it, art. Would you like a single sentence on art? Or just go for the big society. Yes, but my point is that it's a rather complex concept, and it's perfect. I'm going to say some more about it in a moment. It's perfectly clear, actually, what it is, which is why you know what it was you were thinking about. But nevertheless, it is not a simple thing any more than any of the other things that I've just mentioned. Let me give you an example of the big society, which I think helps much more to illustrate than concepts. I have in my village in West Dorset a shop, and the shop was owned by someone who decided to leave, and so the shop was going to close. And so some of the villagers, including some members of the parish council, sat down in my front garden, and we conceived a plan to resuscitate this shop, as many other villages have done up and down England, by clubbing together and putting some money together and borrowing some money from the district council and getting a grant or two. And then we bought the shop. And then we remade the shop physically with the labour of the village. And we equipped the shop with the labour of the village. And we painted the shop with the labour of the village. And we stocked the shop. And we volunteer in the shop. I go every month to work there on Sundays, and other people who have other times of day that they can help. And it's the most beautiful shop in England. If you're ever in Thorncombe in West Dorset, you should come there because it's a real experience. And we have a little cafe there in the shop where the villagers bring cakes that they make themselves, and you can buy them, and they're very, very delicious. And you can have your laundry done there, and you can buy your Christmas trees there, and you can get cash there, and there's a little post office there. And if somebody wants something that isn't in the shop, then we order it for them. And when we discover that there's somebody who can't come to the shop, who normally comes to the shop at a certain time of a certain day, someone will go out and find out why they haven't come, so it's also a kind of social service. And a little while back, I was there on one of my Sunday mornings with my wife, selling goods at the till, which we manage rather badly, but nobody minds. People patiently wait while we fumble around with the machinery. And one lady said to me, "Do you know, I've lived in this village for 23 years. And in the last 6 months, I've met more people than the previous 22 and a half years. And this shop has created social capital. And the social capital is revealed in all sorts of ways. There are all sorts of activities now which are bolstered by the existence of the shop. There were already many aspects of social capital in the village. There were arts clubs and first responders societies and photography clubs, and there's the very active Parent-Teachers Association, and there's the usual fete at the school every so often, and there are the people who look after the graves in the churchyard, and so on and so forth. But actually the shop has crystallized all of this. And the village is proud of its shop, and there's a feeling about the shop, which there would never have been if the shop was not owned and run for and by villagers. And I can take you round, I won't bore you forever, but I can take you round village after village in West Dorset where the same sorts of tales can be told. The Shipton Gorge, where the pub was resuscitated by the locals, and so on and so forth. And this is happening also, and has happened over the years, in completely different circumstances. One of the most remarkable people I've ever met in my life was somebody called Scylla Karen in a terribly run-down and challenged estate in Camden. And she had created in this wilderness the beginnings of social capital. She had brought people together to fight against the needles that were dropped on the staircases and the neglect of the place, and to make it a safer and a more decent place to live. And again, she had brought people together. People had started speaking to one another who had lived cheek by jowl with one another, never talked to one another. And that is, again, social capital. Now, those are examples of the big society. They're not something new. They're something that human beings have been doing since time immemorial. They're something which has its own timbre in different places. You know, the feel of the estate in Camden is different from the feel of a village in Dorset, but actually there are great similarities as well. And these similarities have to do with mutual support and a sense of community, which goes beyond something which could be invented by somebody who'd arrived on the scene and decreed that there should be a community. And it has to do with human capital and not physical capital. Yes, it may involve, as it did in the case of the shop, or indeed in the case of the estate, the development of physical capital. But in the end, what differentiates it from the bulldozers coming in and rebuilding things from the outside is that it's the human beings who fashioned it in their image, and therefore the physical apparatus is not imposed upon them, but is real to them, and is therefore sustainable in a way that it isn't, I think, almost always. It's endlessly the case that the bulldozers go into a derelict area and it's rebuilt, and within 10 or 20 years it's back to where it started, because actually the human capital has not been built. The sense of community has not been built. And those are very profound ideas, and they go back to ideas about family, but they extend beyond family, and they have connections with ideas of democracy and local government and localism, but they're not just about institutions, they're about people and the interactions of people with one another and the feelings that people have for and about one another. And that's what the big society is about. And what it's suggesting is that if you want to have a society, a nation, in which people have the chance to grow up and to live lives of which they really find fulfilling, you don't just need institutions or systems or transfers of money or rules or laws and police forces and so on. You need social capital. You need to build it, you need to sustain it, you need to foster it, and it's not something that can be done mechanistically or easily. It requires great imagination. And so the big society is a call to governments and to lawmakers and to politicians, but also to many others, to act together in a way that builds social capital. And to conceive law, it goes with the behavioral science and nudging, in the sense that you have to conceive law as a way of encouraging and creating a framework within which one can encourage the formation of social capital, rather than as a mechanistic pull-me-push-you thing that produces results on its own. And that's a very profound shift in the way one conceives the relationship between the state and society. And the reason why everyone goes around saying they don't understand it and yet keeps on using it, and also uses it actually perfectly intelligently, is that everything I've just said actually you already knew. I haven't said anything you didn't know already. You perfectly well knew.
Down on charities, for example, universities, colleges, schools, and now apparently Christian societies. So how does that foster a big society when you're knocking away the underpinnings of what has been, if you understand England or Britain or what does it describe, the social fabric and the political impetus that has been for the past generation?
That's an extremely interesting. I want to come back incidentally to first question a moment. But extremely interesting point. Unfortunately, completely false. The present government has fostered a whole series of techniques to bolster and reinforce the voluntary and the charitable. Now, it's perfectly true that, like, well, okay,
Sorry,
okay, okay. Let me continue for let me continue for a moment, and maybe I can show you what it is. Of course, it's true. Of course, it's true that, like every other part of our society and state and economy, the charities that depended on a large amount of public money have got less of it. Of course, that's true. It's true because we are engaged in a deficit reduction program. Firms have got fewer handouts. There's less money being spent in the public sector, and there's less money being handed out to charities. Of course, that's true. But actually, underneath that, we've done an enormous amount to foster. So, for example, the whole development of social impact bonds and of social finance and of the big society capital is an enormous change. And people are now coming from all over the world. I recently attended a great conference of them to see what it is we're doing to find means of replacing one kind of funding with another for the charitable and the voluntary sector. We have invented a huge range of new ways of delivering public services which depend on and use the voluntary sector and social enterprise. The whole program of payment by results in the rehabilitation of people on drugs, in the rehabilitation of prisoners, in the transfer from worklessness to work, so on, all of that offers huge new opportunities for those in the voluntary sector and the social enterprises to get to work and do things which previously were conceived entirely as public sector or occasionally as private sector. Now, this is a very complex tapestry, and of course when you are engaged in deficit reduction you'll still have some charities which were receiving a lot of money which are now receiving less or which have closed as a result. Of course that's true. But at the same time there's this huge underpinning going on. And the reason for that is precisely because we believe that by building social capital and by using social enterprise and voluntary sector and the energies of them, we can often achieve better results for our people than we can simply by administering things from the top down. That's the thesis. Now, incidentally, you could agree or disagree with all of that, but just as a matter of fact, that is what is going on. Now, let me come back to this sort of double question, half of which was about civil liberties and the other half of which was about what has changed about my view of being conservative as a result of coalition. Very ingeniously woven together. Let me just start with the civil liberties pattern. There are, of course, a series of things which we are doing, which you might approve of or disapprove of, which are hugely advantageous to the citizen in empowering the citizen against the state. So, for example, we have opened up to an astonishing extent, transparently, the actions of the public sector. And just a huge amount of information which was previously not made available, we're now making available in all sorts of ways. Some of it literally just made available, so you can go and find out what we spend up to £25,000 on anything. You can get huge amounts of data out of every department that was previously concealed. Not malignly concealed, but just not revealed. But also, actually, we're taking it, and increasingly now, because we realize we need to do this, we're taking proactive steps to enable the citizen to find out what's happening. So, for example, crime maps. Everybody's focused on police and crime commissions, in my view, a very important reform, but that goes with crime maps. And I was told when crime maps were first developed, when we put forward the idea and work was done on them, that we were very lucky if anyone bothered to look at them at all. And there have been hundreds of millions, hundreds and hundreds of millions of hits on the crime maps. People want to know what's happening in their area. Now, it's very uncomfortable for government, of course, because it means that the citizens suddenly discover what is happening on their street, in their neighborhood. They can see it right there in front of their eyes. And that's intentional. And that's a large part of a shift of government from being something where you can't actually find out what's happening to you and where you're given liberty to find out. That goes with liberties of choice, incidentally. A huge program of trying to empower people, whether they're patients or pupils or whatever. Again, you can quarrel with this, you disagree with the strand of thought, but roughly what we're doing in each of the public services is to try to find ways to empower people to make choices and have their own choices represented in what actually happens to them. Again, an enormous step forward in their liberties. Now, then you come to sort of what are regarded as crunch issues by Ms. Chakrabarty, for example. So I suspect that one of the things you're thinking about is the data communications bill. Now, here we face a very difficult balancing act. And incidentally, I think all governments do. I don't think in this respect we're really very different from anyone else. On the one side, you have the question of how do you assure a high level of security for the population against people that are plotting really quite unpleasant things. And on the other side, you have the need to ensure that people's rights are properly respected. How do you balance these? And I guess this argument is going to run and run. My own view is that actually the ability to do with electronic communication what it has been possible to do all the way through with telephone calls, and to trace the origin and destination of electronic communication by ensuring that it is preserved, the origins and destinations of communications are preserved by the companies, so that if you are trying to build up a picture of a terrorist network and you know a bit of it, you can, if you're the agencies or whatever, you can go and try and find out who's connected to it. I think is a kind of sensible thing to allow if you are trying to defend yourself against terrorism. And I don't think it threatens our civil liberties to any marked degree. Clearly you can argue about this. But that's what we've been trying to do in those sorts of domains, achieve a balance. And that's very similar to the very carefully calibrated proposals in the Justice and Security Bill about trials, where we face a very, very difficult situation where clearly one wants to ensure a fair trial, but on the other side you want to try to ensure within the limits of the fair trial that you can actually conduct a trial without revealing to people that are determined to blow us up things which would enable them to blow us up. So I would say that there's an undiluted effort at transparency and liberty of choice and empowerment. When it comes to these very, very tricky balancing items, we've tried to balance them out very carefully in order to preserve some very important principles, but at the same time to preserve our security. Whether we've got all those right or not, history will judge, but that's what we've been trying to do. Finally, I guess it's quite a good place to end. You ask how has my concept of being conservative altered as a result of cohabiting with my Liberal Democrat colleagues for these years. And I have to tell you, I think my answer is not at all. I once got into terrible trouble by describing myself as a Gladstonian Liberal when I was, I think, Shadow Home Secretary. I remain a Gladstonian Liberal. I've always been a Gladstonian Liberal. I find it very congenial working with the current leadership of the Liberal Democrat Party. Danny Alexander and I have had many, many, many conversations over 2 years, and with the exception of issues to do with the European Union about which we do not agree, we have yet to find anything we very much disagree about. So I'm left where I was. I guess he's left where he was. And I suppose that reflects back on something that was said earlier in the evening, which is that every party is, of course, a coalition. And there are many strands to all complex political parties. It so happens that for those of us in the current leadership of the Conservative Party and our colleagues in the current leadership of the Liberal Democrat Party, although there are some important differences, actually there is vastly more in common than divides us. And therefore, neither of us is required. It goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning. Neither of us is required to change our entire sort of framework of thought. We are working together because actually it's quite natural for us to be able to do so, despite the negotiations and the differences about particulars from time to time.
Okay, before I ask you to thank Oliver for a fascinating evening in the traditional way, I do have a couple of announcements. The first is that the 91st meeting of the Mile End Group will take place on the 16th of January, when we're going to be welcoming the Permanent Secretary to the Treasury and newly appointed visiting Professor Sir Nicholas Macpherson, who's going to be talking to us on the history of the Treasury, Part 1. What Part 2 is, and details will be announced in the usual way. The second announcement is that there is food and wine and plenty of it, so please do attack it with gusto in the foyer. And I'd just like to say, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much, Oliver, for coming along and for conducting such a fascinating experience.